Have you ever been judged before you even said a word? Have you ever walked into a room and felt the weight of assumptions pressing down on you? Dr. Grace Mitchell knows that feeling all too well. She is a woman who has spent her life breaking barriers and proving her worth in places where few believed she belonged. But this story is not just about success, it is about transformation. It all begins with a moment that shakes Grace to her core. An encounter at a private terminal where she is questioned, doubted, and dismissed. A small act of prejudice becomes the spark that sets her on a new path. Along the way, unexpected kindness, a taxi driver's quiet pride, a letter from a stranger, and the unwavering determination of a young woman named Jasmine reminds Grace of something she had almost forgotten. Change starts with small moments. As Grace faces challenges in boardrooms, builds bridges between worlds, and mentors voices that deserve to be heard, she begins to see her success in a new light. But can she overcome the resistance that comes with shaking the status quo? And can one woman truly create a ripple of change that inspires others to rise with her? The early morning sun glinted off the glass facade of the private terminal, casting golden beams across the polished asphalt. Limousines and sleek black cars were lined up neatly, their pristine surfaces reflecting the quiet hustle of luxury. Everything about the terminal felt exclusive and untouchable, a place reserved for the few who had managed to climb to the very top. Dr. Grace Mitchell stepped out of her car, the soft click of her heels punctuating the air as she adjusted the strap of her sleek black leather bag. She exuded confidence, poised and sharp, the very image of composure. Her tailored navy blazer hugged her frame perfectly over a silk blouse, and her hair was pulled back into a low, flawless bun. Grace had spent years learning how to enter spaces like this, uninvited spaces, where she had earned her place, but was never fully welcomed. The driver, Marcus, an older man who had been with her for years, handed her luggage to a nearby attendant and gave her a nod. "Safe travels, Miss Mitchell." Grace smiled faintly and thanked him, her gaze steady as she turned toward the terminal doors. The world outside was calm, almost serene, but her mind was already racing. She had a major business meeting waiting for her in Chicago, one that could seal the future of her company, Mitchell Enterprises. The meeting was the culmination of years of hard work, countless hours of sacrifice, and the battles she had fought to build her business. The automatic doors slid open with a soft hiss, welcoming Grace into the pristine lobby. Polished marble floors reflected the faint hum of luxury, while plush leather seating arranged near the glass walls added an understated elegance. Other passengers, dressed in designer clothing, moved with quiet assurance as if they had belonged to this world since birth. Grace made her way to the check-in counter, where a sharply dressed attendant greeted her with a smile that felt more rehearsed than genuine. "Good morning, ma'am. How can I assist you?" "Grace Mitchell. I have a reservation for the private jet to Chicago," Grace replied calmly. Her voice was firm but polite, every syllable measured. The attendant's smile faltered slightly as her fingers flew over the keyboard. Her gaze shifted to the screen, then back to Grace, her expression wavering between confusion and doubt. "Just a moment, Miss Mitchell," she said, her voice soft but stiff. Grace stood still, waiting patiently, though she felt the undercurrent of something familiar: doubt, disbelief, suspicion. It was subtle but sharp, a silent questioning of her right to be there. The attendant's tone shifted as she straightened, plastering on a practiced smile. "Everything seems to be in order. Your jet is ready. Would you like me to escort you to the gate, or would you prefer to wait in the VIP lounge?" "I will go straight to the jet." "Thank you," Grace replied, offering a tight smile before moving through the hallway leading to Gate 5. The corridor was quiet, the silence broken only by the faint echo of her footsteps against the smooth tiles. As Grace neared the gate, her jet came into view, a sleek, glimmering aircraft bathed in sunlight. It was hers. She had worked relentlessly to get to this point. Yet, even now, the weight of expectation clung to her like a shadow. A tall, uniformed man stood by the entrance to the jet, Captain Joel Carter. His expression, sharp and stoic, shifted when his gaze landed on Grace. For a brief moment, she saw a flicker of something. Hesitation, maybe doubt. "Good morning," Grace offered, her tone polite. The captain's expression hardened slightly. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he asked. The question sounded innocent, but the clipped tone carried an edge. Grace held his gaze. "I am here for the flight to Chicago." The captain's eyes flicked to her luggage, then back to her. He crossed his arms, his lips curling into something faintly resembling a smirk. "This is a private flight, ma'am. Perhaps you are at the wrong gate?" Grace felt her pulse quicken, but she remained calm, her voice steady. "This is Gate 5, is it not?" "It is," he replied with an air of finality. "But this jet is not for commercial passengers. It is reserved for private clients." He said the word private with an unmistakable emphasis, as though it were a secret code Grace could not possibly know. "I am a private client," she replied, her voice firm yet unshaken. The captain shook his head slightly, a soft, condescending chuckle escaping him. "Ma'am, I think there has been some miscommunication. Maybe try the main terminal." Before he could finish, a flight attendant, a young woman named Erin, approached with a clipboard in hand. She glanced at Grace, her gaze lingering on the tailored blazer, the impeccable luggage, then flicked to the captain. "Is there an issue here?" The captain gestured toward Grace dismissively. "She believes she is on this flight." Grace inhaled deeply, her patience wearing thin. "I do not believe I am on this flight," she corrected. "I am." Erin turned toward Grace, trying to mask her skepticism. "Ma'am, do you have your reservation details?" Grace pulled her phone from her bag, tapping a few times before handing it to the flight attendant. Erin glanced at the screen, her brow furrowing slightly. She looked back up, her face paling. "Oh, everything is in order," she said quickly, handing the phone back. "You are indeed listed as the primary client for this flight, Dr. Mitchell." The captain's expression froze as Erin turned to him. "It is her jet, sir." There was a beat of silence, thick, heavy, uncomfortable. The captain's jaw tightened, though he stepped aside stiffly. "My apologies," he muttered. Grace said nothing as she walked past him, the quiet click of her heels echoing like a statement of its own. She ascended the stairs to the cabin, her posture tall, her movements deliberate. The sting of humiliation simmered just beneath her composed exterior. Inside, the jet was immaculate soft leather seats in ivory hues, polished wooden panels gleaming under recessed lights, and the subtle scent of fresh flowers and citrus. It was a space that mirrored her achievements. As she settled into her seat, Grace's fingers tightened around the armrest. The encounter replayed in her mind the smirk, the dismissive tone, the presumption that she did not belong. It was a feeling she knew all too well, one she had encountered at every stage of her life. Grace gazed out the window, the sunlight warming her face as the engines hummed to life. Despite the bitterness of the moment, she knew that her success was more than a seat on a jet. It was proof of her resolve. It was proof that she could shatter expectations, even in spaces where the doors had once been locked to her. As the jet lifted off the ground, soaring through the clear blue sky, Grace let out a soft breath. She thought of how far she had come, but also how much work still remained. Somewhere, deep in her thoughts, a new question began to form. What if she could use moments like these not just to stand her ground, but to make the world better for others? The horizon stretched before her, wide and endless, as the jet climbed higher. Grace closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of the day settle. Little did she know, an unexpected encounter was waiting for her, one that would change everything. The hum of the engines surrounded Grace, as the private jet climbed higher into the vast blue sky. The city below grew smaller, a network of roads and buildings, reduced to nothing more than lines and dots. From this altitude, everything seemed peaceful, almost too serene compared to the turbulence swirling inside her. She sat upright in the ivory leather seat, her shoulders squared and her hands resting in her lap. To anyone observing her, Grace Mitchell would appear completely composed, as she always was. Yet, beneath her polished exterior, her thoughts churned. The captain's smug expression replayed in her mind the doubt in his voice, the presumption that she did not belong. It was the kind of judgment she had faced her entire life. Years of success had dulled the sting of these moments, but it never quite disappeared. It was a quiet reminder that no matter how hard she worked or how much she achieved, there would always be people who saw her first through their own narrow lens. Grace turned her gaze to the window, watching clouds drift past like slow-moving ships. The sunlight reflected softly off the wing of the jet, a stark contrast to her mood. She had learned long ago how to rise above these moments, but this one lingered. Maybe it was because she had not expected it here, not on her own jet, surrounded by the fruits of her labor. This aircraft represented years of sacrifices, late nights, and relentless determination. It was a symbol of everything she had fought to achieve a seat, not just at the table, but in her own domain. Yet still, she had been questioned. Still, she had been made to feel like an outsider. Grace exhaled, letting her shoulders relax ever so slightly. What bothered her most was not just the captain's behavior, it was the feeling of resignation that came with it. Had she grown so used to these slights that she now simply endured them? Her mind wandered to her childhood, to a time when standing up for herself felt like fighting a losing battle. Raised in a small, modest neighborhood, Grace had watched her parents work tirelessly to give her and her siblings a better life. Her father, a mechanic, often came home with grease-stained hands and an exhausted smile. Her mother worked double shifts at a diner, never complaining about the long hours. They had always told Grace the same thing: work hard, and the world will see your worth. But the world had not made it easy. Grace could still remember the first time she was dismissed in a classroom, the teacher skipping over her raised hand, as though she were invisible. She remembered the job interviews, where her qualifications were doubted, and the boardroom meetings where her voice was ignored until someone else repeated her words. Yet, through every challenge, Grace had persevered. She had learned to carry herself with a quiet strength, letting her accomplishments speak when others refused to listen. But moments like today made her wonder if her success had come at a cost. Had she become so focused on proving herself that she had forgotten the reason she started in the first place? Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft knock of the flight attendant, Aaron, who entered the cabin holding a tray with a cup of tea. Aaron's movements were careful, as though she were trying to make herself as invisible as possible. "Miss Mitchell," she said softly, placing the cup on the small table beside Grace. "Chamomile tea. I thought it might help you relax during the flight." Grace looked up, surprised. Aaron's expression was one of quiet sincerity, no longer the skepticism she had shown earlier. There was something unspoken in her face, an apology perhaps, though she did not voice it aloud. "Thank you," Grace replied, her tone warmer than she expected. Aaron lingered for a moment, as though she wanted to say something more, but instead, she straightened and moved back toward the cabin door. Grace watched her leave, the faint sound of her footsteps disappearing into the hum of the engines. The small gesture, the tea, offered without prompting, caught Grace off guard. It was unexpected kindness, a rare moment of acknowledgement in an otherwise dismissive world. And for some reason, it made her pause. Grace reached for the cup, letting the warmth seep into her hands. It was such a small thing, but it reminded her of something her father used to say: "It is not the grand gestures that change the world. It is the small acts of kindness that ripple outward." For the first time since the flight began, Grace felt something other than anger. She felt tired not physically, but emotionally. She had been pushing so hard for so long, proving herself again and again, that she had not realized how much weight she had been carrying. The thought stayed with her as the flight continued, stretching into the quiet hours above the clouds. She sipped the tea slowly, its calming warmth spreading through her like a balm. Her father's words echoed in her mind, settling there like seeds, small acts of kindness. By the time the jet began its descent into Chicago, Grace's mood had shifted. The bitterness of the morning still lingered, but it no longer felt overwhelming. Instead, she found herself reflecting on how moments like these could be used not just to defend herself, but to create something meaningful. As the wheels touched down on the runway, Grace closed her eyes for a brief moment and exhaled. The meeting waiting for her in Chicago would demand her full focus, but something else had taken root inside her, a thought she could not ignore. What if she could use her position to lift others? What if her success could be a bridge instead of just a fortress? Grace had spent years proving that she belonged, but maybe it was time to do something more. The door to the cabin opened, and Grace stood, smoothing her blazer as she prepared to leave. Outside, the bright Chicago sun greeted her, casting long shadows across the tarmac. A black car waited nearby, the driver already holding the door open for her. As she stepped off the jet, Grace felt a shift inside her, subtle but certain. The frustration of the morning had begun to evolve into something else: determination, purpose. She walked toward the car with her shoulders back, her stride steady and deliberate. The challenges of the day had reminded her of where she came from, but they had also shown her where she needed to go. Inside the car, Grace leaned back against the seat, staring out at the city skyline in the distance. Her thoughts lingered on Aaron's quiet gesture, on her father's wisdom, and on the countless times people had shown her unexpected kindness. Those moments, small as they were, had mattered. And now, Grace thought, it was her turn to do the same. The engine hummed softly as the car pulled away from the tarmac, carrying Grace toward the next chapter of her journey, one that would challenge her to look beyond herself and discover what true success could mean. The Chicago air greeted Grace with a crispness that sharpened her focus as she exited the terminal. Sunlight reflected off the towering glass buildings of the city skyline, a reminder of how far she had come and how far she still had to go. Her driver had not shown up first in Grace's meticulously organized life, and now she found herself standing near the curb, feeling strangely out of place. Her phone buzzed in her hand. It was Emma, her assistant. "Miss Mitchell, I just spoke with the car service," Emma said, her voice edged with urgency. "There was a mix-up. They will send someone, but it might take an hour." Grace sighed, though her voice remained calm. "Thank you, Emma. I will manage." She ended the call and turned toward the street, where taxis lined up, their yellow cabs gleaming in the sunlight. The last time Grace had taken a taxi, she had been fresh out of college, clutching a resume with more hope than certainty. That version of herself felt so distant now. With no other choice, she approached the nearest cab and tapped on the driver's window. The man inside rolled it down and offered a tired but genuine smile. He looked to be in his 60s, his salt and pepper hair visible beneath a worn baseball cap. "Good afternoon, ma'am. Need a ride?" "Yes," Grace replied, opening the back door. "The Wells Tower downtown, please." "Of course. Hop in." Grace slid into the back seat, her leather bag carefully placed beside her. The interior of the cab was clean, but lived in small tokens of the driver's life scattered across the dashboard. A family photo, an air freshener shaped like a tree, and a small cross dangling from the rearview mirror. The driver adjusted his rearview mirror and glanced at Grace. "You in town for business?" "Yes," Grace said simply. The driver nodded knowingly, his hands steady on the wheel as he pulled into traffic. "Big meetings, I bet. You look important, like someone with places to be." Something about his tone softened Grace's tension. It was not condescending, nor was it probing. It was just a simple observation, spoken with quiet respect. "Thank you," she replied. "I suppose you could say that." They fell into a comfortable silence as the cab weaved through Chicago's bustling streets. Grace looked out the window, her mind drifting to the upcoming meeting. She had spent months preparing for this. Her company's future rested on these negotiations. Yet her thoughts kept pulling her back to the terminal, to the small act of kindness Aaron had shown, and to the bigger questions those moments had sparked. "Do you work long hours?" Grace asked suddenly, surprising herself. The driver glanced at her through the rearview mirror. "I do. Been driving this cab for nearly 30 years. It is not always easy, but it pays the bills." He paused before adding, "I have a daughter I am helping put through school. She wants to work in business like you, I imagine. Says she wants to change the world." Grace raised an eyebrow, her interest piqued. "She sounds ambitious." The driver's face lit up, the lines around his eyes softening into a smile. "She is smart as a whip, too. But it is hard for her, you know. People see where she comes from, and they think she is not good enough. I tell her all the time, keep working, keep pushing, and someone will see the fire in you." Grace's throat tightened at his words. They echoed the same advice her parents had given her as a child, back when ambition felt like an impossible climb. She stared out the window, his words lingering. "She is lucky to have you," Grace said softly. The driver chuckled, shaking his head. "No, I am lucky to have her. Keeps me going on the days when this job gets tough." The cab slowed to a stop at a red light. As the driver looked in the rearview mirror again, his smile softened. "You know, ma'am, people like you give me hope. I tell my daughter all the time, look at those women on the news, running companies, changing the world. One day, you will be there too." Grace blinked, caught off guard by his words. "You think so?" "I know so," he said simply. "Sometimes people just need someone to see them for who they are, not where they come from. A little kindness goes a long way." Grace felt her chest tighten. She thought about the captain at the terminal, his dismissive tone, and how quickly he had decided who she was. But now, here was this man, a stranger, who believed in his daughter's potential, even when the world refused to see it. The light turned green, and the cab moved forward. For the first time in hours, Grace felt a small shift inside her, a warmth she could not quite explain. When they reached the Wells Tower, Grace handed the driver a folded bill, far more than the fare required. "Thank you for the ride." The driver looked down at the money, his eyes widening. "Ma'am, this is too much." "Please," Grace interrupted gently. "It is for your daughter. Tell her to keep pushing." The driver's face softened, his voice catching. I will, ma'am. Thank you." Grace nodded once, then stepped out of the cab. The driver stayed there for a moment, staring after her with gratitude that was almost tangible. As Grace entered the towering building, her heels clicking softly against the marble floors, she felt lighter, almost as though a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. That single ride had changed something. In the elevator, she stared at her reflection in the mirrored walls. Her image was as polished as ever, but something in her expression had softened. The driver's words stayed with her. Sometimes people just need someone to see them for who they are. By the time she entered the boardroom, her focus had sharpened, but her perspective had shifted. The table was filled with men and women in suits, their discussions sharp and rehearsed. As the meeting began, Grace listened, carefully observing the room. When her moment came to speak, Grace did something unexpected. "I want to start by addressing something broader than today's negotiations," she said, her voice steady but deliberate. The room stilled. All eyes turned to her. "We have an opportunity not just to grow as companies, but to change the culture we operate in," Grace continued. "I believe we need to prioritize diversity, bringing in voices that have been overlooked for too long. It is not just good business. It is the right thing to do. Her colleagues exchanged glances, some nodding, others caught off guard. Grace felt her heart pound, but she did not waver. For years, she had built her company to be a fortress, but now she realized it could be a bridge, one that lifted others instead of simply defending her place at the table. After the meeting, as the room emptied, a young associate approached her. He looked no older than 25, his hands nervously clasped. "Dr. Mitchell," he said softly, "I just wanted to say thank you. What you said, it meant a lot. People like me needed to hear that." Grace smiled, a warmth spreading through her chest. "Keep pushing," she told him. "The world needs your voice." As she left the boardroom, Grace thought about the cab driver's daughter, about the young associate, and about herself once, just a girl from a modest neighborhood, hoping someone would see her for who she truly was. Sometimes kindness came from unexpected places, and sometimes it was enough to change everything. Grace walked through the revolving glass doors of the Wells Tower, the weight of the meeting she had just concluded sitting heavily on her shoulders. Her polished demeanor remained intact, her stride confident as always. But beneath the surface, her mind buzzed with reflections. The young associate's quiet gratitude lingered, echoing alongside the words of the cab driver earlier that afternoon. Sometimes people just need someone to see them for who they are, not where they come from. The thought gnawed at her, steady and insistent, as if demanding her attention. The elevator ride to the building's rooftop restaurant, where a post-meeting dinner with potential clients was scheduled, was silent. The mirrored walls reflected Grace back at herself, composed as always, but her gaze softened slightly. For so long, she had built her success on the belief that excellence could speak louder than judgment, that achievement could silence doubt. And yet, moments like today reminded her how far there was still to go, not just for her, but for so many others who never got their chance. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and Grace stepped into the dimly lit space. The restaurant exuded wealth. Crystal chandeliers hung overhead, reflecting soft light onto dark mahogany tables, while towering windows showcased the sprawling Chicago skyline at sunset. A waiter led her to a private table at the back, where 3 executives were already seated, their laughter subdued but familiar. "Grace," one of them greeted warmly as she approached. His name was Stephen Carter, CEO of one of the country's leading logistics firms. "Fantastic presentation earlier, truly impressive." Grace smiled as she took her seat. "Thank you, Stephen. I appreciate that." Stephen and the others launched into conversation, dissecting the day's discussions and celebrating minor victories. Grace nodded along, contributing when necessary, but her focus wavered. The faces around her seemed increasingly detached from the world she had been reflecting on all day: soaring profits, deals signed with the flick of a pen, discussions devoid of the people these decisions ultimately affected. At one point, the waiter brought a tray of sparkling glasses, offering wine to the table. Stephen gestured to Grace. "Come on, you have to celebrate with us. You carried that room today." Grace shook her head politely. "Just water for me, thank you." Stephen raised an eyebrow, teasing lightly. "Still the disciplined one, I see." There was no malice in his tone, but Grace felt a slight pang. Disciplined. It was a word often used to describe her, a sanitized compliment that masked the reality of what she had to be: focused, relentless, and above all, perfect. The conversation drifted as the meal arrived, and Grace found herself observing the men around her. Stephen's voice boomed with confidence as he recounted a story of closing a major deal, the others laughing and nodding in encouragement. She envied the ease they carried, the effortless sense of belonging they seemed to exude. For them, success was a birthright. For her, it had been a battle. Suddenly, Stephen turned his attention back to Grace, his smile warm. "So, tell me, Grace, what is next for you? You are at the top of your game." A company like Mitchell Enterprises could dominate the international markets within the next 5 years. Expansion plans, maybe? Grace hesitated, her fork hovering over her plate. Expansion had always been the goal numbers. Revenue, bigger markets. It was the next logical step, but somehow, the words felt hollow. I have been thinking a lot about impact lately, she replied slowly. Stephen raised an eyebrow. Impact? Grace nodded, her tone measured but purposeful. Not just growth for the sake of growth. I mean creating opportunities, building something that makes a difference. The table quieted for a moment, the shift in tone unexpected. One of the executives, a man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair, chuckled softly. You have already made a difference, Grace. Your success speaks for itself. Grace's gaze hardened, though her voice remained calm. Success for one person does not mean success for all. There are talented people out there, hard-working people who just need someone to open a door for them. Stephen leaned back in his chair, studying her with curiosity. That sounds admirable, but it is also a risk, Grace. When you start focusing on ideals, you lose sight of the bottom line. I disagree, Grace said firmly, her voice unwavering. I think companies that invest in people really invest in them, build stronger foundations. It is not just good ethics. It is good business. The words left her mouth with more force than she intended, but she did not regret them. For so long, Grace had learned to speak in ways that made others comfortable, but tonight she could not shake the thought of the cab driver's daughter, or the young associate who had thanked her earlier. Stephen nodded slowly, though a flicker of doubt remained in his expression. You have always been bold, Grace. I respect that. The conversation shifted again, and the men returned to their easy banter. Grace finished her meal quietly, her mind still circling. Had she said too much? Maybe, but for the first time in a long while, she felt like she had said something that mattered. When dinner finally ended, Stephen clapped a hand on her shoulder as they left the restaurant. You know, Grace, I would not bet against you. You always prove everyone wrong. Grace smiled faintly, though her thoughts remained elsewhere. Thank you, Stephen. Safe travels. The night air was cool as Grace stepped outside the building, her heels clicking softly against the pavement. Her car was waiting for her, but as she reached for the handle, she paused. Across the street, she noticed a small diner, its neon sign flickering, casting a warm glow onto the sidewalk. It reminded her of the place where her mother used to work. Instead of getting into the car, Grace turned and crossed the street. The bell above the diner door jingled as she entered. Inside, the space was small and cozy, the scent of coffee and frying bacon hanging in the air. A handful of customers sat at the counter, their voices soft as they chatted with the waitress on duty. Grace slid into a booth near the window and ordered a cup of coffee. She let herself sit in the quiet for a moment, surrounded by the hum of ordinary life. For so long, she had been chasing success, moving from one boardroom to another, always reaching for the next milestone. But tonight, she felt something shift, a recognition that success without purpose was not enough. When the waitress returned with her coffee, she smiled warmly. Anything else I can get you? Grace shook her head. No, thank you. The waitress lingered for a moment, studying her. Rough day? Grace looked up, surprised by the question. You could say that. Well, the waitress said with a kind smile, whatever it is, tomorrow is a new day. You look like someone who knows how to turn things around. Grace chuckled softly. I hope so. As the waitress walked away, Grace wrapped her hands around the warm cup of coffee, letting its heat settle her. It was such a small kindness, a stranger offering words of encouragement, but it struck her deeply. For the second time that day, Grace was reminded of something she had forgotten, the power of seeing people, of acknowledging their worth, of offering a bit of hope. The cab driver, the young associate, the waitress. None of them had known the weight Grace was carrying, but their kindness had reached her anyway. As she stared out the window at the quiet street beyond, Grace made herself a promise. She would not lose sight of what mattered, not the numbers or the deals, but the people. Tomorrow, she would begin finding ways to open those doors, just as others had done for her. Because sometimes, Grace thought, the smallest gestures could change everything. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Grace's Chicago hotel suite, casting faint golden streaks across the floor. The air was still, save for the hum of the city outside. Grace sat at the corner desk, a steaming mug of black coffee beside her, reviewing her notes from the previous day's meeting. On paper, everything looked like a victory. Deals were on the brink of closing, and Mitchell Enterprises had cemented its place as a powerhouse. Yet, her thoughts drifted. Grace had not forgotten the dinner conversation from the night before. She could still hear Stephen's voice, his quiet skepticism when she spoke about impact. It was not his doubt that lingered, but the feeling that she had said something true. The hollow language of profits and numbers no longer seemed to fulfill her the way it once had. Pushing her notes aside, Grace stood and walked to the window. From this height, Chicago's skyline spread before her, steel, glass, and concrete woven together into a symbol of opportunity. Somewhere down there, lives were unfolding. People like Ben, the cab driver, and his daughter Jasmine. People working hard for a chance to be seen. Her phone buzzed, jolting her from her thoughts. It was Emma, calling from New York. Grace picked it up and greeted her. "Good morning, Emma," she said, her voice even but tired. "Good morning, Dr. Mitchell," Emma replied briskly. "I hope your meeting yesterday went well?" "It did," Grace said, though the words felt automatic. She paused. "Emma, I need you to begin research on mentorship programs, ones that connect underrepresented individuals with leaders in business. Find organizations we can collaborate with, or ones that need funding." There was a short pause on the line. Emma's efficiency never faltered, but Grace could tell she was surprised. "Of course, I will pull together a list. Is this something you want announced formally?" "Not yet," Grace replied. "This is personal. For now." "Understood. Anything else you need?" Grace hesitated, then said softly, "Send me the latest stats on hiring diversity at Mitchell Enterprises. I want to take a closer look at the numbers. I will get those to you by the afternoon." "Thank you, Emma," Grace said, ending the call. She leaned back against the desk, her gaze distant as she thought about her next steps. A knock at the door pulled her back to the present. Grace walked over and opened it to find a bellhop standing there, a small cream-colored envelope in hand. "Good morning, ma'am," the young man said, offering her the envelope. "This was left for you downstairs." Grace raised an eyebrow, but accepted the letter. "Thank you." The bellhop nodded and left. Grace closed the door behind her and looked down at the envelope. It was unmarked, no sender, no return address. Curiosity flared as she broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. The handwriting was neat, careful, and unfamiliar. "Dear Dr. Mitchell, you do not know me, but yesterday I watched you at the terminal. I saw how the crew treated you and how you stood your ground. I saw you hold them accountable. I have worked in this industry for years, and moments like that are far too common. Most of us pretend not to see. We stay silent, afraid to lose what little place we have. But you stood firm. You reminded me that silence helps no one. I wanted to thank you. Watching you gave me hope. Hope that things can change. Please keep going. Some of us are watching, learning, and finding our voices because of people like you. Sincerely, a witness." Grace's chest tightened as she read the letter, her fingers trembling slightly as they gripped the paper. She sank slowly onto the edge of the bed, rereading the words, each sentence landing with a weight she had not expected. Some of us are watching, learning, and finding our voices because of people like you. She stared at the letter for a long moment, her emotions a mixture of gratitude and sadness. How many others had stayed silent? How many people had accepted being overlooked, dismissed, and underestimated because it was easier or safer than speaking out? Grace had spent so much of her life fighting to be seen that she rarely paused to consider who might be watching. She thought of her younger self, a girl who had stared at powerful figures from afar, searching for signs that someone like her could belong in those spaces. Now, without realizing it, she had become that person for someone else. The letter had stirred something deep inside her. She thought of the cab driver's words the day before. Sometimes people just need someone to see them for who they are, not where they come from. Grace exhaled, her mind sharpening with purpose. For too long, she had been playing by rules that were not made for her, trying to fit into a system that resisted her every step. But what if she could change the system itself? What if her success was not just a statement of her resilience, but a platform to lift others? She placed the letter carefully on her bedside table as though it were fragile. Then, crossing the room, she picked up her phone and dialed Emma again. "Dr. Mitchell?" Emma answered quickly. "Emma," Grace said, her voice steady but carrying a new energy. "I want you to set up a meeting with the leadership team when I return. I have a proposal I need to present." "Of course. What kind of proposal?" "An initiative, something that connects overlooked talent with opportunities in leadership and business," Grace replied. "I want Mitchell Enterprises to lead by example. If we talk about change, we have to create it." Emma paused for a beat, then said, "Understood. I will arrange it." "Thank you," Grace said, before hanging up. She placed the phone down and looked back at the letter, its words etched into her mind. Grace had always been determined to succeed, but now she felt something more. A responsibility to turn her personal victories into something larger. The road ahead would not be easy. She knew there would be skepticism, resistance, and doubt from those who would rather keep things as they were. But Grace had spent her entire life navigating obstacles, and she had no intention of stopping now. That afternoon, as Grace packed her things to head back to New York, she tucked the letter carefully into her bag. It would travel with her not as a reminder of the challenges she faced, but as a testament to the impact she could make. The plane ride home was calm, the horizon stretching endlessly as the jet glided above the clouds. Grace leaned back in her seat, looking out at the sky with a renewed sense of clarity. Hope. It was a simple word, but it carried power. Somewhere out there, people were watching, waiting, hoping, and Grace was ready to meet the moment. The mid-afternoon sun poured through the windows of Mitchell Enterprises' glass-walled boardroom, casting long beams across the polished oak table. Grace sat at the head, her tablet in front of her, but her attention remained on the faces of her leadership team. Some were eager and attentive, others hesitant, their uncertainty just barely masked. The air buzzed with tension. Grace knew why. What she was proposing was bold. She had spent the better part of the morning laying out a framework for an initiative that would transform the company's hiring and leadership development practices, mentorship programs, equitable opportunities for underrepresented candidates, and outreach to communities long overlooked by corporate America. Emma, standing near the screen at the front of the room, scrolled through a slide presentation as Grace spoke. "We have an opportunity to lead, not just as a business, but as an example of what the future can look like," Grace said firmly, her tone even. "This is not about charity. It is about untapped potential talented people who have been ignored because we are too comfortable with the way things have always been done." Stephen Carter, head of strategy and one of her longest-standing team members, leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowed. "Grace, I understand the vision, but this is a big risk. We are already one of the most competitive firms in the industry. What problem are we trying to solve?" Grace turned her gaze to him, her expression calm but resolute. "The problem is that talent exists everywhere, Stephen, not just in boardrooms or Ivy League schools. We are missing out because we are only looking in the same places. If we change where we look and who we mentor, we will not just find better people, we will build a stronger company. Stephen hesitated, his skepticism wavering. Others exchanged glances, some nodding quietly, others still cautious. Grace pressed forward. This initiative will bring in new voices, new perspectives, and fresh ideas, she continued. It is not just good for the communities we will reach, it is good for us. We grow when we invest in people who deserve a chance. Emma stepped forward, her confidence unwavering. We have already identified several organizations that focus on mentorship and leadership for young professionals from underrepresented backgrounds. We will start with partnerships and pilot programs to measure the impact. Stephen glanced around the table, gauging the reactions of his peers. And if it does not work? Then we adjust, Grace replied. That is what leaders do. We adapt until we get it right. The room fell silent for a beat. Finally, Stephen nodded, his hesitation softening into something that looked like reluctant approval. I cannot argue with that. Grace allowed herself a small exhale as Emma clicked to the final slide. We will review our progress quarterly, and I expect full buy-in from this team. Change starts at the top. As the meeting ended and the room emptied, Grace remained seated, her gaze drifting toward the windows overlooking New York's sprawling skyline. For the first time in a long while, she felt a flicker of something new, a sense of purpose beyond the numbers and quarterly reports. Emma approached, holding a stack of papers. I think they will come around, she said softly, as though reading Grace's thoughts. They will, Grace replied. They just need to see the results. Emma smiled faintly. And they will. It is a good plan, Grace. The right plan. Grace nodded, grateful for Emma's quiet confidence. Thank you. Later that evening, Grace found herself in a part of the city she had not visited in years. The community center sat on the corner of a bustling street, its brick facade aged but well-maintained. Bright murals adorned the walls, paintings of children playing, books, and hands reaching upward toward the sky. The sound of laughter and conversation spilled from the open doors as Grace stepped inside. She had come to observe one of the mentorship programs Emma's team had identified. It was not enough for her to fund initiatives, she wanted to see the work firsthand, to understand the people behind it. The main hall was alive with energy. Groups of young adults clustered around tables, listening to mentors who were guiding them through mock interviews and resume-building workshops. The atmosphere was casual but purposeful, filled with a sense of hope that was both contagious and humbling. Grace stood quietly near the back, observing. She saw herself in the eager young faces scattered across the room, the determination, the desire to be seen. Excuse me, are you lost? The voice was soft but confident. Grace turned to see a young woman standing beside her, holding a stack of papers and a clipboard. She was in her early 20s, dressed in a simple blazer over a blouse, her dark curls framing her face. Her expression was curious but kind. Grace offered a small smile. No, I am exactly where I need to be. The woman tilted her head, clearly unconvinced. You do not look like you are here for a resume workshop. Grace chuckled softly, extending her hand. Grace Mitchell. The young woman's eyes widened as she took her hand in a firm shake. The Grace Mitchell? Mitchell Enterprises? That is me, Grace replied. Wow, the woman breathed. What are you doing here? Learning, Grace said simply. What about you? The woman's expression shifted, her confidence returning. My name is Jasmine Thompson. I volunteer here a few times a week. I run the mentorship workshops for new participants. Grace froze for a beat, the name striking her like a soft bell. Thompson? Jasmine nodded. Yeah, my dad drives a cab. He is the hardest working person I know. He actually mentioned meeting someone yesterday, said she was sharp as a tack, and reminded him of me. Grace's chest tightened as recognition dawned. Your father gave me a ride yesterday. Jasmine blinked, stunned. Wait, you were the woman he talked about? He could not stop going on about how generous and kind you were. Grace felt a warmth spread through her, the kind that only came when the pieces of a puzzle began to align. Your father spoke about you too. He is proud of you, Jasmine. Jasmine's expression softened, her voice quieter. He is my biggest fan. The two women stood in silence for a moment, surrounded by the hum of voices in the room. Then Grace spoke, her tone careful but genuine. Tell me about this program. What brought you here? Jasmine smiled. I started as a participant when I was 16. I was shy back then, did not think I could belong in rooms where people wore suits and talked about investments and careers. But my mentor showed me that I had a place, that I could build something for myself. It changed my life. Grace studied her carefully. Jasmine's words struck a familiar chord, reminding her of her own journey. And now, you mentor others? Because someone did it for me, Jasmine said, meeting her gaze. It is how change works, right? One person reaches back and lifts another up. Grace nodded slowly, her mind already racing. She could see the spark in Jasmine, the fire her father had spoken about. The fire in you. Jasmine, Grace said, what do you want to do next? Where do you see yourself? Jasmine hesitated. Honestly, I want to work somewhere like Mitchell Enterprises one day, a place where I can help create opportunities for people like me, but that feels far away. It is not, Grace said firmly. Come by my office next week. I would like to discuss a mentorship opportunity for you. Jasmine's eyes widened. Are you serious? Very. A slow smile spread across Jasmine's face, lighting up her features. I will be there. As Grace left the community center later that night, the memory of her ride with Ben returned, blending with the encounter she had just had. What had started as a simple act of kindness, a conversation had brought her here. And now, Grace realized, she was standing at the beginning of something much bigger. The hum of the city below buzzed faintly through the expansive windows of Grace's corner office. Sunlight poured in, highlighting the sleek lines of the minimalist furniture. The view stretched far, a panorama of towering skyscrapers and winding streets, a sight Grace had worked a lifetime to earn. Jasmine sat across from her, perched in a high-backed chair, clutching a leather-bound notebook in her lap. Her shoulders were square, her expression a mixture of awe and uncertainty. Grace could see the way Jasmine's eyes wandered, flicking between the sprawling skyline and the polished plaques on the wall. It was the look of someone who had imagined rooms like this, but never believed they would stand in one. Thank you for having me, Dr. Mitchell, Jasmine said softly, her voice careful but steady. Grace, she corrected with a faint smile. Here, we are on equal footing. Jasmine's lips parted slightly in surprise before she nodded, her fingers tightening around the edges of her notebook. Grace leaned back in her chair, studying her carefully. She saw something of herself in the young woman's posture, a quiet determination mixed with a lingering doubt, as if waiting for someone to tell her she did not belong. You are here because you have earned this, Grace said. Your work at the community center shows initiative and leadership. That is not something I take lightly. Thank you, Jasmine replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She paused, gathering herself. But if I am honest, I am nervous. I have never done anything like this before. Then you are already ahead of most people, Grace replied. Self-awareness is the first sign of growth. We all start somewhere. Grace stood, walking to the massive whiteboard that stood against the wall. She picked up a marker and began writing 3 words: adapt, learn, lead. This is what I expect of you during your mentorship here, Grace explained. You will adapt to unfamiliar situations. You will learn from every challenge, and you will find your voice as a leader. Jasmine nodded, scribbling notes as Grace continued. Over the next few months, you will shadow me and members of my leadership team. You will sit in on meetings, observe decision-making processes, and contribute when you are ready. I will not ask you to be perfect. I will only ask you to give your best." Jasmine looked up, her eyes bright with equal parts fear and excitement. "I will not let you down." "I believe you," Grace said firmly. The first few weeks of Jasmine's mentorship were both eye-opening and overwhelming. Each morning, she arrived at Mitchell Enterprises early, her blazer smoothed and her notebook ready, nervous energy carrying her up the elevator to Grace's office. She followed Grace into meetings with senior executives, sitting quietly in the background, her pen moving furiously as she tried to capture every word. Sometimes, she understood what was happening, the strategies, the projections, but other times, the conversation seemed to drift into a language she did not yet speak. One afternoon, after a particularly intense budget review, Grace noticed Jasmine's face as they exited the boardroom. Her shoulders slumped, her confidence fraying at the edges. "Jasmine!" Grace called as they walked down the quiet hallway. Jasmine turned quickly, standing straighter, as though bracing herself. "Yes?" Grace gestured for her to follow. She led Jasmine back to her office and closed the door behind them. Without saying a word, Grace walked over to the bookshelves lining her walls and pulled down a slim leather binder. She placed it on the desk in front of Jasmine, gesturing for her to open it. Jasmine hesitated, then flipped the cover open. Inside was a collection of handwritten notes, old charts, and outlines of business ideas, some crossed out or marked with edits. "What is this?" Jasmine asked softly, her fingers brushing the paper. Grace sat across from her, folding her hands neatly. "That is my first business plan. I was 24 years old. I wrote it in a small apartment at a desk I bought second-hand. Half of what is in there never worked." Jasmine looked up, her brow furrowed. "But this is where you started?" Grace nodded, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Every journey begins with uncertainty. It took me years to understand the language of business, to navigate boardrooms, and to trust that I belonged there. I failed many times before I succeeded." Jasmine's shoulders relaxed slightly as she let the weight of Grace's words settle. "It is easy to look at you now and think you never struggled." "I have struggled more than I can say," Grace replied. "And so will you. But you will learn to stand taller each time. You are not here to be perfect, Jasmine. You are here to grow." Jasmine let out a shaky breath, as though hearing those words had lifted a heavy weight from her. "Thank you for telling me that." Grace stood and gestured toward the door. "Now, take 15 minutes to clear your mind. Then meet me back here. I want to hear your thoughts on what we discussed in the budget review. Do not hold back, your perspective matters." Jasmine nodded quickly, a spark of determination in her eyes as she stood and left the office. As the door clicked shut, Grace leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting to the binder still on the desk. It was not often she shared that part of her story, but she knew Jasmine needed to hear it. The girl reminded her so much of herself, too afraid to stumble, too focused on proving herself. Grace knew that overcoming those fears would be the hardest part of Jasmine's journey, but it would also be the most transformative. In the weeks that followed, Grace watched as Jasmine began to grow. Her early hesitation gave way to quiet confidence. She began asking questions in meetings, sometimes stumbling over her words but pushing through nonetheless. When Grace pressed her for feedback or ideas, Jasmine no longer looked down nervously. She looked Grace in the eye and spoke, her voice steady. One afternoon, Grace invited Jasmine to join a meeting with a potential client. It was a smaller deal, but the stakes were still high. Grace watched as Jasmine listened intently, scribbling notes while the room debated strategies. When the meeting ended, Grace turned to her. "Jasmine, tell me your thoughts." Jasmine blinked, startled to be addressed in front of the group. For a split second, Grace saw the doubt flash across her face, but it quickly disappeared. "Well," Jasmine began, her voice calm. "It seems like they are hesitant about our price point. Maybe if we emphasize the value we bring with long-term partnerships, we could shift their perspective." The room fell quiet. One of Grace's senior managers raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. Grace, however, smiled. "That is an excellent point," Grace said. "Let us explore that for the follow-up." Jasmine flushed slightly, but stood a little taller. As they left the conference room, Grace leaned close to her and said softly, "You are starting to find your voice." Jasmine beamed, her confidence blossoming with each passing day. One evening, after most of the office had cleared out, Grace stood at her window, watching the sun dip below the city skyline. Jasmine's words from the meeting echoed in her mind, a perspective that no one else at the table had considered. Grace realized something profound in that moment. This mentorship was not just changing Jasmine, it was changing her too. For years, Grace had been surrounded by people who echoed her thoughts, her strategies, her vision. But Jasmine brought something new, fresh ideas, unfiltered honesty. Perhaps, Grace thought, lifting others up was not just about giving back. It was about creating something better than what had come before. She turned as a soft knock came at the door. Jasmine stood there, clutching her notebook, her face glowing with the pride of someone who had overcome the day's challenges. "Good night, Grace," Jasmine said, smiling. "Good night, Jasmine," Grace replied. As the door clicked shut, a sense of quiet satisfaction settled over her. She had opened a door for someone else, and in doing so, she realized, she had unlocked something new in herself as well. The brisk chill of an early fall morning settled over New York City, painting the skyline with muted shades of silver and blue. Inside Mitchell Enterprises, the atmosphere buzzed with quiet urgency. Phones rang softly, keyboards clicked rhythmically, and the faint hum of conversation drifted through the sleek, glass-lined hallways. Jasmine sat at the small desk just outside Grace's office, her head bent over a thick stack of financial reports. Her notebook lay open beside her, pages filled with detailed observations and questions. She chewed the end of her pen thoughtfully, eyebrows furrowed as she worked through the numbers. It had been 2 months since Grace had brought her on as a mentee, and Jasmine could feel herself changing. She was no longer afraid to speak up in meetings. She carried herself with a quiet confidence that she had never known before, though her doubts still crept in from time to time. "Coffee?" Jasmine looked up, startled, to see Marcus, Grace's driver, standing nearby. He held out a steaming paper cup with a small smile. "Oh," Jasmine said, blinking in surprise. "You did not have to." "Noticed you have been at that desk since before I got here," Marcus replied with a chuckle. "Thought you could use a little pick-me-up." Jasmine smiled, her shoulders relaxing. "Thank you, Marcus. You are a lifesaver." "Hard work deserves a little kindness," Marcus said simply, before turning toward the hallway. "Keep it up, kid. You are doing good things here." Jasmine watched him leave, her fingers wrapping around the warm cup. It was such a small gesture, but it brightened her morning. The people in Grace's orbit, Emma, Marcus, even the custodial staff who greeted her each night, seemed to move with quiet purpose and kindness. And while their roles were vastly different, there was an unspoken thread connecting them all: respect for Grace Mitchell and the culture she had built. Jasmine sat up straighter, sipping the coffee as she refocused on the task at hand. A few hours later, Grace called Jasmine into her office. The large space was immaculate, sunlight pouring in through floor-to-ceiling windows. Grace stood near the glass, her back to the room, deep in thought. Jasmine hesitated at the door. "You wanted to see me?" "Yes," Grace replied without turning, her voice measured. "Come in." Jasmine stepped forward, clutching her notebook, waiting as Grace finally turned to face her. There was something different in her expression today, something tight and uncharacteristically troubled. "I need your thoughts on something," Grace said, motioning for Jasmine to sit. Jasmine did as she was told, heart pounding slightly. Grace sat across from her, sliding a folder across the desk. This morning, we received news that one of our largest clients is reconsidering their partnership with us. It is not official yet, but if they pull out, it will set back our fourth quarter projections significantly. Jasmine swallowed hard, flipping open the folder. Inside were pages of data, financial summaries, client reports, and correspondence. The client had expressed concerns that Mitchell Enterprises' recent focus on diversity initiatives might detract from their ability to prioritize profits. Jasmine's brow furrowed as she read. They think the changes you are making will hurt the bottom line? Some do, Grace replied quietly. And they are watching us closely, waiting to see if we stumble. Jasmine looked up, confusion and disbelief on her face. But these changes what you are doing are good. They are necessary. I know, Grace said, her tone steady but sharp. But change always comes with resistance, Jasmine. People cling to what is familiar, even when it is no longer serving them. Jasmine looked back down at the reports, her mind racing. She thought about the people she had met through the community center and the programs Grace was building. These initiatives mattered, yet here was a client, ready to dismiss it all as a distraction. Do you want me to put together a counterproposal? Jasmine asked hesitantly. Grace studied her for a moment, then shook her head. No. I want to know what you think we should do. Jasmine froze. Me? Yes, Grace said firmly. You have a fresh perspective. I value that. If you were in my position, how would you approach this? Jasmine's pulse quickened. She glanced down at her notebook, hesitating. It felt like too much to ask, like too much weight for her to carry. But Grace's steady gaze was unwavering, patient. Adapt, learn, lead. Jasmine inhaled deeply and spoke slowly, her voice steady despite her nerves. I think you should remind them what makes this company different. Grace raised an eyebrow. Go on. Mitchell Enterprises is strong because it invests in people. These initiatives do not take away from that, they enhance it. If you walk back your values now, it will tell them that the only thing you care about is short-term gains. But if you double down and show them why this matters, they will see that you are building something bigger. Something sustainable. Grace leaned back in her chair, a small smile tugging at her lips. You think they will listen? Jasmine swallowed. Maybe not right away. But if we show results, if we show them that this approach works, they will have to. The room fell quiet as Grace considered Jasmine's words. Finally, she nodded, her expression resolute. You are right. We will not compromise our values for the sake of comfort. People need to see that there is strength in doing what is right. Jasmine's shoulders relaxed as Grace stood, walking to the window. Thank you, Jasmine, she said softly. You reminded me of something I needed to hear. Jasmine blinked in surprise. I did. Yes, Grace replied, turning back toward her. The power of conviction comes not from being right all the time, but from standing firm when it matters most. Jasmine smiled faintly, a warm glow spreading through her chest. That evening, as Jasmine packed up her desk, she found herself replaying the moment in Grace's office. For so long she had been afraid to speak up, afraid that her voice did not carry enough weight. But today, Grace had listened. Today, she had made a difference. As Jasmine headed toward the elevator, Marcus stepped out of the shadows, his hands stuffed in his coat pockets. Long day? Jasmine nodded, grinning. A good one, though. Marcus chuckled. You are earning that seat, kid. Do not forget to enjoy it. Jasmine tilted her head, studying him curiously. How did you end up working for Grace? Marcus paused, his expression thoughtful. Years ago I gave her a ride. She was not much older than you are now. Stressed, overwhelmed, but sharp as ever. I treated her like any other passenger, and when I dropped her off, She looked me straight in the eye and said, "You treated me like I mattered. I will not forget that." Jasmine's heart swelled. And she did not forget. "No," Marcus said with a smile. "Grace never forgets kindness. That is why she wins." Jasmine stood silently as the elevator doors opened. The words echoed through her mind as she rode down to the lobby. Grace's success was not just about strategy or numbers. It was built on something deeper: kindness, conviction, and the belief that people mattered. As Jasmine stepped out into the cool night air, she felt a shift within herself. She was beginning to understand something she had not seen before. Change was not always about grand gestures. Sometimes it started with small moments, an encouraging word, an opportunity given, or a simple ride across town. And those moments could change everything. The glass walls of Mitchell Enterprises' main conference room reflected the golden morning light, streaking it across the polished mahogany table where the senior leadership team had gathered. Grace stood at the head of the room, her presence as composed as ever, though her voice carried an uncharacteristic edge of conviction. "This is not just a moment," Grace began, her gaze sweeping across the room. "It is a shift in how we think about business, about leadership, and about people." The presentation behind her displayed bold figures and charts, evidence that Mitchell Enterprises was thriving, despite doubts about the company's initiatives. Jasmine sat toward the back of the room, watching closely, scribbling notes in her leather notebook as Grace continued. "Our investments in diversity and mentorship are not distractions. They are strengths," Grace pressed on. "In the last quarter alone, departments piloting these programs have outperformed expectations. Teams are stronger, more innovative, and more engaged." Stephen Carter, ever the skeptic, raised his hand slightly, his tone softer than before. "The results look promising, Grace. I will give you that. But how do we ensure this momentum does not plateau? We are breaking new ground here." "We stay committed," Grace replied without hesitation. "We measure, adapt, and hold ourselves accountable. This is not a one-time initiative. It is who we are." She turned her attention to the slides on the screen, displaying a list of proposed partnerships with community organizations and universities. "This quarter, we will launch the Bridge Initiative," she announced, the words crisp and deliberate. "It is a mentorship and outreach program designed to connect untapped talent with opportunities in industries that have historically shut them out." Jasmine's heart skipped a beat. The name Bridge Initiative echoed Grace's philosophy: building pathways instead of walls. Grace continued, "Through internships, scholarships, and leadership development, we will nurture individuals who may not otherwise get their chance. Mitchell Enterprises will not just participate in change, we will lead it." Around the table, heads nodded thoughtfully. There were still questions, of course, but Grace could sense a shift. The resistance that had lingered at the start of her vision was beginning to give way to understanding. Slowly, but surely, they were seeing what she saw: a future built on purpose as much as profit. An hour later, the meeting concluded, and the room began to empty. Jasmine waited until the last executive had left before approaching Grace, her notebook clutched tightly in her hand. "That was incredible," Jasmine said, her voice filled with quiet admiration. Grace turned, offering a faint smile. "Thank you, but the real work starts now." Jasmine nodded. "The Bridge Initiative, I love the name. It feels right." Grace studied her for a moment, as if deciding something. "You will play a role in it, Jasmine." Jasmine blinked, stunned. "Me?" "Yes," Grace said, walking toward the window. "You have a perspective that is invaluable to this work. I want you to help build the framework, identify what participants need, what support they will require, and how we can make it sustainable." Jasmine swallowed hard, both overwhelmed and thrilled. "I will do my best, I promise." "I know you will," Grace said softly, turning to face her. And remember this, Jasmine. Leadership is not just about speaking. It is about listening, hearing what people need, and finding a way to meet those needs. Jasmine scribbled those words in her notebook, a quiet sense of pride blooming within her. Over the next few weeks, Grace and Jasmine worked side by side, refining every detail of the Bridge initiative. They met with educators, community leaders, and nonprofit directors, listening to their challenges and learning about the barriers young talent faced. One afternoon, Grace and Jasmine traveled to a university in New Jersey to meet with a group of students enrolled in a business development program. The modest lecture hall buzzed with energy as students filed in, their notebooks and laptops at the ready. Grace stood at the front, her posture poised yet approachable, while Jasmine sat to the side, watching intently. "Good afternoon," Grace began, her voice carrying through the space. "I want to start by saying this. I see you. I see your ambition, your drive, and the potential that brought you here today. I also know that potential is not always enough. Sometimes doors remain closed, no matter how hard you knock." The room fell silent, every eye fixed on Grace. "When I started my company, I did not have connections or a roadmap. I built my path from the ground up," she continued, "and I want to help others do the same." She gestured toward Jasmine. "This is Jasmine Thompson, a brilliant young woman who works with me as part of a mentorship initiative. She, like many of you, once wondered if she could belong in rooms like this if her voice mattered. Today, I can tell you with certainty that it does." Jasmine's cheeks flushed as a few students turned to look at her, admiration clear in their eyes. Grace stepped back, gesturing for Jasmine to join her. Jasmine hesitated for a split second before rising to her feet, her legs trembling slightly as she approached the podium. Grace gave her a reassuring nod, a silent reminder that she was ready for this. "Hi," Jasmine began, her voice soft but growing stronger. "My name is Jasmine, and if I am honest, I never imagined standing here today. I used to think people like me could not find a place in business, but someone gave me a chance. Someone showed me that I belonged, and it changed everything." She glanced briefly at Grace, who nodded encouragingly. "This program, the Bridge Initiative, is about giving people like us that chance," Jasmine continued. "It is about building paths where none existed before. If I can do this, so can you." The room erupted in applause. Jasmine's heart pounded as she stepped back, glancing at Grace with a small, grateful smile. Grace placed a hand on her shoulder, whispering, "Well done." On the ride back to the city, Grace sat beside Jasmine in the back of the car. The highway stretched out before them, bathed in the soft orange glow of the setting sun. "You did something powerful today," Grace said, breaking the quiet. "I was terrified," Jasmine admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Good," Grace replied with a faint smile. "That means you were growing." Jasmine looked out the window, her expression reflective. "Do you think this program will really work?" "Yes," Grace said without hesitation, "because it is built on something real. You saw those students, Jasmine. They believed in it because they believed in you." Jasmine looked down, a soft smile tugging at her lips. "I just hope we can make a difference." "We will," Grace replied. "Change does not happen overnight, but it starts with moments like today. One voice, one step at a time." Jasmine turned to look at Grace, her admiration evident. "How do you always know what to say?" Grace chuckled softly, the sound warm and unexpected. "I do not. I have just learned to trust what matters." The car continued on, the city lights growing brighter in the distance. Grace leaned back in her seat, a sense of quiet satisfaction settling over her. She had spent years building walls around her success, guarding it like a fortress. But now, she was building bridges, connecting people, lifting them, and creating pathways where none had existed. And she was not doing it alone. As the skyline loomed closer, Grace looked at Jasmine young, determined, and full of potential, and felt something she had not felt in a long time: hope. The steady hum of voices filled the large conference hall as people settled into their seats, the energy in the air a mix of excitement and curiosity. Rows of chairs faced a stage adorned with a simple backdrop displaying bold, elegant letters: "The Bridge Initiative Summit." Tall, leafy greenery framed the stage, a quiet symbol of growth, while the bright glow of the spotlight illuminated the podium at its center. Backstage, Grace Mitchell stood in quiet reflection. The muffled sounds of the gathering crowd reached her ears, but she tuned them out, allowing herself a moment to breathe. She adjusted the sleek gold bracelet on her wrist and looked down at the small program in her hand, where her name and photo sat prominently at the top. Below it, Jasmine Thompson was listed as the day's closing speaker. Grace smiled faintly. Jasmine. It had been months of tireless effort, countless hours of planning and partnership, and today marked the culmination of everything they had worked toward. It was not just a presentation, it was a declaration. This is who we are. This is what we stand for. Emma appeared at the curtain's edge, her expression a perfect blend of professionalism and pride. "We are ready, Grace. The room is packed. Media outlets, business leaders, educators, you name it. They are here." Grace nodded, letting out a measured breath. "Thank you, Emma." "Are you nervous?" Emma asked softly, though she already knew the answer. "Not nervous," Grace replied, her voice calm. "Prepared." Emma smiled. "Jasmine is in the front row. She looks ready, too." "Good," Grace said, her lips curving upward slightly. "She deserves this moment." With a final nod, Grace straightened her shoulders and walked onto the stage. The applause swelled as she emerged into the spotlight. Grace moved with purpose, her heels clicking softly against the wooden floor as she approached the podium. The crowd quieted quickly, all eyes on her. For a moment she scanned the room. Faces from every walk of life stared back at her: business leaders in tailored suits, young professionals, community mentors, and students. This was the vision she had fought for, a room filled with people who believed change was possible. "Good morning," Grace began, her voice carrying easily through the hall. "Thank you all for being here today. It is an honor to stand before you at the first-ever Bridge Initiative Summit." The audience listened intently as Grace continued. "Over the last year, we have been reminded of a truth we often overlook, that talent, ambition, and brilliance exist everywhere. But opportunity remains limited, gated off by systems that favor familiarity over possibility." She paused, letting her words settle. The Bridge Initiative was created to change that. It is a promise to invest in those who are overlooked, to build pathways where none existed, and to create a future where success is not determined by where you start, but by the fire you carry within. Grace's gaze lingered on the faces in the front row, landing briefly on Jasmine, who nodded slightly, her eyes alight with pride. "In my own journey, I have learned that leadership is not about holding power for ourselves. It is about sharing it," Grace said. "We are here because we believe in the power of lifting others. We are here because when one person rises, we all rise." The audience broke into applause, and Grace stepped back for a moment, allowing the energy to build. When the room quieted, she spoke again. "Today, you will hear stories from young voices, people who are already changing the narrative. And it is my pleasure to introduce someone who exemplifies what this initiative is all about." Grace turned to gesture toward the side of the stage. "Please welcome Jasmine Thompson." The applause erupted as Jasmine stood, a mixture of nerves and excitement visible in her expression as she walked onto the stage. Grace gave her an encouraging nod as their paths crossed, then stepped back, allowing Jasmine to take the spotlight. Jasmine stood at the podium, her hands resting carefully on either side. The room felt enormous, the silence pressing against her, but she refused to let it overwhelm her. "You belong here," she reminded herself. She looked out at the crowd, her gaze pausing briefly on Grace, who stood at the edge of the stage, watching her with quiet pride. "Good morning," Jasmine began, her voice steady despite the fluttering in her chest. "My name is Jasmine Thompson, and I am here today because someone believed in me." The room fell silent, every ear tuned in. "For a long time I did not think I belonged in spaces like this," Jasmine continued. "I thought success belonged to other people. People with connections, with privilege, with the right background. But I have learned something powerful. Success belongs to those who dare to step forward, even when they are afraid." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I was given an opportunity, one that changed my life. Grace Mitchell saw something in me that I had not yet seen in myself. She showed me that kindness, belief, and guidance can unlock doors we did not even know existed." Jasmine's voice grew stronger as she continued. "The Bridge Initiative is not about handouts. It is about handshakes, about reaching out to someone and saying, 'I see you, I believe in you. Let me help you grow.' And that changes everything." She looked out at the students in the room, her voice softening. "To those of you sitting here today, wondering if you belong, let me be clear. You do. You are seen. You are capable. You are powerful. And this is just the beginning." The applause that followed was thunderous. Jasmine stepped back, her heart racing, her face flushed with pride. As she left the podium, Grace was there waiting for her. "You were incredible," Grace said quietly, placing a hand on Jasmine's shoulder. Jasmine smiled, her eyes bright. "I had a great mentor." That evening, as the summit wrapped up, attendees mingled in the softly lit atrium. Grace moved through the crowd, shaking hands and listening to stories, each one a reminder of why this work mattered. Students approached her nervously to thank her, while leaders and educators expressed their admiration for the initiative. Toward the back of the room, Grace spotted Jasmine talking animatedly with a group of students. She looked confident, her voice carrying with ease as she shared her story. Grace smiled to herself, a quiet satisfaction settling over her. This was the ripple effect she had hoped for, one voice inspiring another, creating waves of change that would stretch far beyond this room. Hours later, Grace stood alone on the balcony of her home, the cool evening breeze brushing against her face. The city sparkled in the distance, its lights a reflection of endless possibilities. She thought of the cab driver who had offered her kindness that day, the letter from the anonymous witness, and Jasmine's transformation. It started with small moments, Grace realized. A gesture of belief, a spark of hope. A door opened. Grace had spent her life proving that she could rise, but tonight she felt something deeper, fulfillment in helping others rise with her. Her phone buzzed softly in her hand. It was a message from Jasmine. "Thank you for everything. This isn't just a program, it's a new beginning." Grace smiled, placing the phone down on the table. She looked out at the horizon, where the sky met the city lights, and let herself feel the quiet triumph of the day. Change, she realized, was not measured by a single moment. It was built brick by brick, voice by voice, step by step, and this was only the beginning. The sun was beginning to rise, painting the city skyline in shades of gold and pink. Grace sat on the balcony of her home, a cup of coffee in her hand. The cool morning air carried a quiet stillness, a contrast to the day's excitement at the Bridge Initiative Summit. In her mind, Grace replayed the applause that had echoed through the hall, the conversations with students filled with hope, and Jasmine's confident voice at the podium. For so long, Grace had carried her success like armor proof that she belonged. But now, she understood something far greater. Success is not a solitary journey. From a cab driver's quiet pride in his daughter to an anonymous letter of encouragement, small acts of kindness had set this change in motion. It had taken time, perseverance, and belief, but the bridge they were building would stand for years to come. Grace looked out at the city, her thoughts filled with possibility. There were more voices to lift, more doors to open, and more bridges to build. The work was not done, but today had proven something undeniable: when you choose to create change, others will follow. As the sun rose higher, Grace whispered to herself, "This is just the beginning." If this story inspired you, remember that every act of kindness, no matter how small, can create ripples of change. Whether it is believing in yourself, encouraging someone else, or building opportunities for others, you have the power to make a difference. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of resilience, hope, and transformation, please like this video to show your support. Share it with someone who needs a reminder that kindness matters. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss an inspiring story. Your support helps us continue sharing these powerful stories that remind us of what is possible when we stand up, lift others, and create change together. Thank you for watching, and remember, you are part of the bridge that connects dreams to reality. Until next time, stay kind, stay strong, and keep building those bridges.